have to go through this same process. And what we found is that, yeah, actually we do. And so NASA has its own NASA open source agreement, the NOSA, just like you have, NU has the GPL. We can't really use the GPL. That sort of is a one that's harder for us to do. Berkeley's okay. But because we have the NOSA, it allows us to release things as open source and have the community participate and continue to work and actually share and do the open source projects. We have some work with SourceForge and other places. But I think it's that next step. Okay, great, we're consuming open source. How do we actually share it? Because these are the things that we have to think about. And in my job as a web manager, sometimes I have to rein people back in who are so excited and want to share things. So we just have to share responsibly. We want to make sure that software we share has integrity. So if they're doing data and working and coming up with these really great assessments from the data, that the data tools that we provide are accurate and that you can make that assessment using that data tool, those kinds of things. So I find it really interesting how the conversation is changing. And when I look at NASA's open source agreement, what I see is it's sort of mirroring the whole process that we're doing with the terms of service. So if you look at these social media services and the government is having to write its own terms of service in order for us to deal with the indemnification clauses and, and specific things, it's the same with open source. Eventually I could see us having our terms of service, for who knows, a federal government open source agreement that gives us the terms we need and allows us more easily to share with our respective communities.
A federal open source license sounds pretty exciting. I need one of those right now. I think I think I'm here wearing a few different hats, so I'd like to go through my history to maybe provide you some perspective on how I'm looking at this. I used to be an intelligence analyst at DIA, and I left around 2005 right as the community was starting to use things like MediaWiki and WordPress and Jabber. And I never really got a chance to participate in those. I was like an early tester of them, but I was not involved in the Intellipedia wave. So since then, I've been sort of an outsider looking in at the intelligence community as an independent consultant. And one of the things I was working on for the past few years was a concept for an analysis tool that would help analysts share information and compare their viewpoints. For various reasons, I just decided to open source it in the end, hoping that would, I could ride that wave that Intellipedia started, but it hasn't really happened that way. And I think that might be because while agencies are more open to getting open source in the door, they're still cautious about using it for experimentation purposes. They will accept open source if it is established and very widely used by the rest of the world. But they're not going to bring in something that some guy wrote in his apartment and start playing with it, even in a safe environment. So there's that. And then 6 weeks ago, I started working for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau implementation team. The CFPB was created out of the financial reform regulation last year, and I'm on the technology implementation team there. So among the things that I expect to be doing over the coming months is formulating an open source policy and deciding what kind of infrastructure we have. And that's really exciting because any cultural impediments that might keep other agencies from doing cool stuff with open source software, we aren't really faced with that. We're not faced with cultural impediments or technical ones. Even if, say, an agency really wants to use something, maybe all their infrastructure doesn't really allow them to. We don't have any of that right now. We're building our infrastructure from the ground up. So it's sort of a greenfield, and we can do whatever we want. And in some ways, it's sort of a test bed for the future of federal IT. And I'm interested, Emma, you were saying that, so you can't use the GPL. And I'm very curious about that because that's one thing we need to iron out for ourselves. And also you said the challenge is sharing it. Well, how do you? Are you using things that the rest of the world uses, or do you post it to your website?
Both.
Okay.
So today we have, let's see here. We actually have some arrangements with SourceForge, so where you can look up NASA products on SourceForge now, and part of our Open Government Initiative response to the memo was, here's how we're going to be working with open source and providing that in a way that is not just on our website. Because a good chunk of it, is on our website, because that's where we started.
Yeah.
But as for GPL, I'd have to hook you up with our patent counsel. Well, that's actually one thing, is Goddard Space Flight Center has the most enlightened patent attorney I have ever met. And so one reason that we're lucky is that we have intellectual property lawyers who understand the internet. And I think having an agency where you can, if you're staffing up a new agency, make sure that you have IP lawyers who understand not just, your patent stuff, but they get the internet. That helped me tremendously with Spacebook. It helped me tremendously with some of these others, because you could have a conversation and think through what are the implications of certain decisions. So he could look at the GPL and say, well, these are the clauses that we have an issue with. Berkeley doesn't have these clauses, and in fact it's pretty close to the NOSA, so we're able to use that. And that's why it's like the terms of service. People who've been working those have a really clear understanding of the very specific things that they have to address. So I can hook you up with him. Brian Gertz, I will rave about. He's the best patent attorney. Counsel who understands intellectual property with software. And he said there's only a few in the federal government, because mostly they understand patents, trademarks, copyright. They don't necessarily understand the internet and software at the same time.
Excellent. Well, the CFPB it's kind of sounds like what they always say in Silicon Valley, which is how God created Earth in 6 days. He had no installed base. So it's anyway, and then NASA. So I'm kind of thinking of looking at GSA and also at the Census Bureau, because you've got kind of two extremes. One, NASA, which is a kind of a geek culture where you got people who get it, and they're hired because of their expertise, and CFPB, which is a green field. But you're sitting in the oldest federal bureaucracy now. This is the place that honestly kept Wang computers on life support when they were in Chapter 11, because we had such a large installed base that we didn't want to move off of. So people don't usually think of the State Department as being an early adopter, and yet we've been able to at least begin to use some of these social media tools, social software behind the firewall. But there still is this kind of, I think, a challenge of convincing people that it's safe, that the procurement process can handle open source software, that your IT configuration control board can manage the process because patches come at different times, and you've got new features and security patches kind of bundled together. So how it's more the process that sometimes chokes on the decision. The processes have been designed to handle COTS products, and so when you bring something that doesn't really fit, how do you address that, and how do you deal with those processes to kind of, you almost have to rebuild the process to be open source versus COTS agnostic. So you have processes that kind of make it difficult. Any guidance or thoughts on that?
Not really, but for my DoD days, it definitely seemed like people wanted to spend a lot of money on something. And if it didn't cost a lot of money, then why, first of all, that sounds risky. Sounds like it doesn't work, kind of. And also, we want to pay for someone to be supporting it. And also, the government has this sort of, they freak out at the idea of something that's free because there are rules about. Right, right, and but that's unless that same service or good is available to everyone else. So, yeah, I don't know. I probably know less about procurement than maybe anyone else in the room.
I know less. I think, though, that one of the things, I work with the Office of Citizen Services and Innovative Technologies, and so what we do is we actually work across agency lines, and so I can't, and I would not deign to speak for my esteemed colleagues who are actually doing the hard work and the hard lift in terms of keeping the systems going at GSA, but I could talk about some of the things that we've observed, and I think that I think that Matt's comments were, his initial comments were really important in that it's not that government isn't using open source software. I would wager, and I don't really like to bet, that most people are running their websites on Apache. There's nothing new about that, but people are comfortable with it. Everybody is doing that. And so, we have a model that allows us to use a web server software and other types of software, so I guess my question is how does that happen? And so I think that when we create, so how do we take the models that we already have of procurement and understanding that it's hard to procure something that's free, and so what really what are you buying? And I think that that's some of the challenges. Although I think Lisa could talk a little bit more about kind of how they were able to implement. I think that's really, did you buy it? Did you build it? I mean, did you build a team to do it internally, or?
Sure. In the what I'll call the early days, a lot of it was the IT staff building systems to show that we could do this. One of our earlier systems, Census QuickFacts, was built very quickly on an open source stack, and because we knew, and this is a different point, but because we knew that the tech implementation would go relatively quickly, we did spend our time talking with the stakeholders, determining what statistical profiles would be of most use, doing the usability. And the tech implementation was, really the easy part. And I think it is with some systems these days. And we do, for some of our, some parts of our OpenStack have support contracts in place, and it's essentially treated as corporately supported software, and that helps think a little bit, on the upper floors. But as far as, that procurement process, we have a software licensing center where people put in their software requests and they mark, is this commercial? Is this, dare I say, freeware or open source? And that software is evaluated on the same level that any other software is. And Gwen and I were talking about this because I'm also now on detail in the Office of Citizen Services and Innovation Technologies with Gwen, and so we were talking a little bit about this, and really it comes down to, does the software do what you need it to do? Does it have the security that you need it to have? That selection is really driven by those business factors. Of course, there were some of the issues I brought up before that did let you introduce open source because of all the other factors that were involved, but are you running Apache because it does what you need it to do? Well, maybe it doesn't. Maybe you need to run something else for some reason. There are options out there, and we've not had specific issues in the procurement or the acquisition process that would differ from an open source selection versus a COTS selection.
And I think that's actually, as you talk about that, I think that's one of the, the challenges is that, is it appropriate for government to prefer open source? Or is it appropriate for government to prefer the best solution for the problem? And I think that as we define our requirements and take a look at the options, that's going to help with the selection process a lot, because I'm actually agnostic. Whatever, I'm any port in a storm. And I think that whatever's going to work the best, and that's going to meet my program goals, and that's going to make sure I can stay within budget, those are the critical factors. And as we're looking at software selection, as we're looking at tool selection, it's important to start by what those business processes are, not, kind of what the software is already.
When it comes to Apache, is it possible that it's, and this is an honest question, I really don't know. Is it possible that it's not the best model because take the average non-tech savvy government executive who might recoil at the idea of using software that anyone can contribute to. They don't know what Apache is. When they go to a website, they don't know what a web server is. When they go to a website, it just works. But when they go to MediaWiki, this is something they're using. And so they might be more inclined to ask the question, hey, what is this thing? And why are we using this? How did we procure this, et cetera? Whereas with the web server, they may not even think to ask that. And I'm just throwing this out there. I don't know. Have you ever seen that?
I think, that's a great point. I think we get much more, it depends on whether it's the cynic in me or who's responding, but the stuff that's deep down, and it's probably more critical because it's the backbone, nobody thinks twice about. There's a ton of open source there. But it's a small market, and so it's the closer it gets to the customer, it also means the bigger the market, which probably means the bigger the value of the fight. And so the idea that the customer touches it, that people fight more over it than if it's the backbone. It's almost like you're building a building and you say, well, what the hell, I don't really care about the rebar, but the paint really matters. So it doesn't really make sense even from a technical security perspective, but again, the cynic in me wonders if there's other reasons. So, I don't know if you want, I think it would be a good time to take some questions, and also we can jump back into a dialogue, but I want to make sure, since we have a lot of people from other agencies and from state here, I'd like to open it up to questions. You're all looking, you have early Friday?
I'm not going to know you, so. So really, it's just a point and a question, really. One was around Matt's point around prototyping for government and experimentation. We're actually working on a project in Britain at the moment, which is probably taking on the most challenging thing we possibly could right now, which is how do we aggregate personal data around a child or a family from the police, from social care, from education, into a single secure app that then enables social workers and others to have a single view of the family and the child, so they can actually understand how many times agencies across the piece are coming into contact with that child, et cetera, et cetera. We've got the big issue, obviously, of data security and data protection. It's open source tech that we're building it in. But even then, there is nowhere for us to be able to host that application which enables us to do that kind of experimentation with any real data. So we've got dummy data coming out of our ears, but we're not able to prove it in a live environment because no agency is willing to have that almost sandpit cloud environment for us to do that experimentation. So we're actually in discussions with the British government about, is there an opportunity to develop that kind of cloud environment for us to play in. So that was just to say, I agree. I think that's a massive issue, and one that's right at the front of my mind at the moment. The other one was around the common issue that unfortunately seems to have migrated from e-government into Web 2.0, which is around the sort of the culture change piece, which is that the bridge builders in government don't really exist. and they're not valued and they're not invested in, the people who would classically be known as change managers. And change manager in government tends to either be too geeky or not geeky enough. And so you normally would pay more money than you should to bring in consultants to do this role, which should actually be the integral binding of an organization and its tech function. And I just don't know how we can win the argument around these people. I mean, I'm biased because I see myself as one of those people who's got a foot in both camps. But it seems to me that a lot of the conversation you just had, if we don't have that bridge building capacity, this conversation is going to happen again in 10 years' time when we call it Web 3.0 or whatever the hell we call it. So.
Well, actually, I mean, Matt's got a proposal on P-score for programmers, which we're really excited, and we've kind of picked up on it and are trying to implement it some here in the state. And it's, I mean, I'll give my little riff on it, and then you can go deep. No, I mean, the riff, the way I take it is that, technologists tend to move around anyway. I mean, I spent some time in Silicon Valley, and, you didn't stay in a company for a career. You stayed in a couple of years and moved. And how do we, and increasingly, except, I think this is an aberration of this recession, but I think people will be much more mobile in their careers. How do government capture those folks and let them come in for a segment so they don't have to come in at the bottom, but they can come in at the right time and say they're going to be there for a couple of years, and they're going to contribute the wealth of their knowledge and experience, and then they'll move on. But that they're valued for that. So,
well, I don't want to give the full spiel, and I don't want to pitch an idea that's sort of a bit off the topic, but basically, it's hard for the government to keep to maintain a talented tech team, because government's always going to move slower than the outside world, especially when it comes to the web. So you could hire 10 brilliant programmers today. We just did hire one today, actually. But if if 3 years from now, he's going to be less sharp. 10 years from now, he's probably
Doing management.
right. Yeah, and the skills.
I call it the numbing and dumbing.
So it'd be great to have some platform to get talented people in who want to contribute but don't want to become bureaucrats. So they can contribute for a little while, and then they go back to away from DC to sharpen their skills once again, and maybe come back again later.
I want to add to that too on the bridge building thing. I think sometimes we don't accept how slowly government moves, and we forget that changes are happening around us because we've become so accustomed to what we see today. The conversation has changed. If you look at the nature of the conversation, a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, it's shifted. So it's not like tomorrow we're suddenly going to have this brand new environment. No, it's slow, but it is happening. And I think sometimes we get discouraged because as evangelists, I'm an evangelist, you want it to be there. You want that vision for the future. And when it's not there, you start getting discouraged. But you can't be discouraged because actually people are getting excited about it, but it takes a long time to roll through it. And I think what we're also seeing is as things change and people become so much more accustomed to the internet, the things they do on the outside, that why can't I do this internally is starting to get through, because the expectation for what quality means, the expectation for what timeliness and transparency mean, they're changing. And I think that when we can take the credit for those baby steps, we can feel a lot more confident. It will always be baby steps. It is the government. So I think there was a question over here.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just wondering if you could speak to something that we're seeing a little bit in my department in Canada is that...
Is the microphone on?
Oh,
I don't know.
sorry, I don't...
It's on.
Is it on? Yeah.
Oh.
Okay. Just one thing I was wondering if you could speak to a little bit is what I've seen in dealing with the IT group is that the solutions are looked for the department as a whole, rather than sort of specific parts of the department in terms of what software you would like to get, or just what you would like to do IT-wise? And have you been able to carve out some sort of space where, well, I'll just try this over here and then see if it works out, rather than kind of fighting an internal battle to roll something out system-wise or enterprise-wise?
Actually, I hear, which is we can't help your needs right now because we're trying to solve it for everybody. We're never going to get there. So that's almost like how do you work out, because people are concerned that if there's a pilot project, pilot is just, the camel's nose under the tent. It's just a way of getting this thing in, and then I'll be stuck having to maintain it forever. There are ways to work it, but again, I think it's going to be different with every department and agency, unfortunately, of how much do you try to solve everything at once, which you can't, and how much do you sort of bridge it.
Or also, like, how do you decentralize, like, the IT function within a department?
See, this is where we're maybe a little bit different. Like, NASA is very different than Canada. NASA is decentralized. So if I want to run something, I can make certain local choices that, in GSA or in Census, they may not have those same choices to do it locally. So this is where there is a wide array of organizationally how IT functions are set up, in the federal government.
I think that the most important tool you have is if you have money. And I'm saying that very honestly, it's true. I mean, you'll see things stood up in government that are funded. I mean, that's how some things happen, and whether it's the camel's nose under, or it's somebody's pet project, or it's the best idea ever. So if you have funding for it, you could do whatever you want to that's off the charts. And so I think that that doesn't necessarily help you if you don't have any money and you want to make some changes. But I think in lieu of money, then the next best thing you have is you have the sugar daddy without the sugar. And so you're looking for an advocate who's going to help you on that, so that if you can appeal to somebody to have this as a project, then you're going to be able to move that forward. So I think that, and that's what I was thinking too about the discussion we're having, it's all about incentives. And so part of it is, and it's finding those incentives that are going to work. Right now in government, it's hurting more on the federal level. Was at some session earlier with state and local people. I mean, they've been under the gun for a long time, and nothing creates creativity like nothing. And I think that as we're having to do more with less, we're going to have to take a look at either. So if you could solve a problem that somebody's having, and it could potentially be done at less cost and solve this problem, you're going to be able to do it. So, and as I was saying before, the incentive isn't, or the reason for being is not to have a certain type of software solution. It's to get your business done. And so it's tying those business cases and creating those incentives, and there's opportunity there, and it's just really kind of being creative about seeing where it is.
I mean, we just quickly to it. I mean, we in e-diplomacy, we fortunately didn't have a budget, so we ended up not going. We went with these very lightweight tools, like MediaWiki for Diplopedia, and that grew again, focusing on pain points. So the team did a great job of identifying folks who had a challenge that would lend itself to a solution using Diplopedia, and each of those people who were successfully doing what they were doing better, more easily, and woven into kind of a natural process, became advocates, and we'd tell their story. And so you have great linear growth because you're meeting a real need, and it was always an option. So nobody has to use Diplopedia. Diplopedia has to be good, because if not, people won't use it because they're not forced to.
Also, Diplopedia is just awesome. We do have a question from the Twitter field from GovWin team, and I wanted to ask it because it kind of follows up with what Dominic mentioned earlier. And what they said was, what advice would you give developers looking to team up with groups currently coding open source software for agencies? Don't all jump on it once.
Do good work. I mean, it sounds really funny, but the closer you're aligned to the mission and the work that we're trying to do, the more we want to use your stuff. Because it's not like I'm picking open source software because it's coded in Perl versus PHP. I'm coding I'm picking something because it aligns with my mission, it solves a problem for me, and also I can get support for it. So I want a big enough support community that's out there that I know it's just not one guy that if it breaks that I won't get it, no one's going to address it.
And please make it accessible to the greatest extent. And to the point earlier from Ben Schneiderman, give it a nice interface, please. But I must say, as my other census hat on as the 508 coordinator, it really helps federal agencies when your programs meet accessibility requirements, or at the least do their best to achieve that.
I'll echo that.
Can you repeat the question? Just because we can interpret that in one of two ways, and one is, what are good practices for developing government software, and the other one is, how do I get started developing on something that the government is going to use? And that's how I took it. I don't know about you guys. Well,
it's interesting.
I want to know the answer too, because a few weeks ago I was that person. Developing something, an open source project, and wanting government agencies to start using it. And now that I'm on the other side, I need to know, ideally, that person would write to me and say, Matt, I want to do free work for you, but I don't know how I would respond to that.
I think it ties to, Matt, I know the problem you're faced with, and I've got a neat way that I think we could work together on it. Because that's going to get your attention. I've got free time, yeah, whatever.
Right.
But I know your problem, and I've thought about it. To me, that is the most interesting thing, and that's probably where more of NASA's open source projects are, within the science community or within everywhere else. Anytime a vendor understands the problems I'm wrestling with, I don't care if it's open source or payware, that gets my attention, and that's really the person I want to work with, is that they've taken the time to understand my needs.
Matt, make sure you talk to your procurement professionals.
Right.
And I'll just add one more point, which isn't necessarily how to get government agencies using their data, but we love to see the really clever way, or using your software, we really love to see the clever ways that people are using our data and making our data easier to use out in the public. I know there are a lot of utilities, for example, for using Tiger line files for geographic boundaries. That is something to help agencies really get their data to be used, which is what gives it its value.
I think following up on that, I think that's there's one thing to have government use the services or the data, but the other thing too is that government is not the only source or the only user of this information. And so if the idea is you have a good idea, you have a good idea. And government may not be the conduit for that person's solution.
First in the back, and then Alex.
Perhaps what I'm asking for already exists, but I wonder if the federal government can share among ourselves how to move forward and change our environment within the agency. So perhaps the larger agencies have fought the battles, but the little agencies, we're fighting those battles now, and we don't have a big team. It may be me and someone else. As an example, we need to try to educate, I think is the right term, general counsel in terms of these issues. As an example, I tried to put a blog on a Google site for our agricultural specialists, and it took 5 months to get to general counsel, and the only information we were asking for was first name, last name, and email. But that, that just basically really slogs things down. I think trying to educate IT, they have an idea that unless you pay a lot of money for it, it's not any good. So if the larger agencies if we could set up some way that you could share those best practices or strategies or rationale with the smaller agencies to help us move forward, we would greatly appreciate it.
Well, I know in the social media world, if you are at a federal agency, you can, or a state local government agency, you can join the federal web managers list, and a lot of these issues are discussed. And I would say, half the things on that list are, hey, we're doing ABC, who's done it, what are the issues, so that they can proactively have those. I definitely, being in central IT, feel some of the pain that IT can bring about, but it's not arbitrary or malicious in any way. We have hindrances that we have to work through also, and what worked really well with us in the 2010 census, in being able to establish so many things that were done on the 2010 census website and with a huge social media campaign, was to bring IT into the picture as soon as you have a spark of a little thought of an idea in your head. Talk to IT, get them involved, on board. There's nothing IT likes worse than being surprised.
I think related to that, one of the things I've seen that has been growing, I don't want to say successful, but has worked sometimes, is really bringing the groups together. And so part of it is I'm seeing more new media or social media or IT councils or whatever that already exists within an agency that's really going to be cross-discipline. So it's going to talk to your people in IT, your top people who may be doing privacy or records management, as well as development and public affairs, and really getting that cross-group together ahead of time and building those relationships. There's a way to maybe take advantage of those 5 months that you spent building this amazing relationship with your legal counsel, and to maybe have another meeting in another month, and maybe bring in your security people or whoever the other people are, so that you start talking to each other earlier. That's within your own agency. But I do want to piggyback on what Lisa was saying about the Federal Managers Listserv. And then another resource that's coming out of our offices at GSA is a website that we brought out a couple weeks ago called howto.gov, which talks about different best practices. And we're really building in different areas in new media, as well as some pieces of technology. There's also some, and there's sample policies that other agencies have used that have been put up there that may be helpful as well. So I do recommend that source.
I agree with Lisa on getting involved early. And one of the things there is, the key phrase I found in working with a legal team is not, can I do this, but how can I do this? And getting them to be partners with you on finding a way. So work with them. The what that you need to do is non-negotiable, but the how you do it, let's work together. Let's figure it out. Maybe it's not a Google group, maybe it's this other thing, but my end goal is this. Help me get there. And I find that if I can have that attitude when I talk with all of my different stakeholders that I need to have on board, that I make a lot more progress. And I think sometimes our smaller agencies actually can get really creative, because like what Gwen said, when you have zero money, you find ways to be really creative and get your mission accomplished.
Not that I'm advocating no money.
Yeah, but it makes you creative.
But I second all of that. When we were launching, or early in developing of Corridor, we got a 2-hour meeting with 40 people who we thought would care about what we were doing, and we went around the room and addressed each one and said, if we bake in this solution to your problems, are you okay? So basically, we want to proceed. Is there anybody who would want to veto this? And that was kind of our green light. Alec?
So one of the things sort of seeing is releasing open data is one thing, right? And then you're encouraging people to work with it, clean it up, find issues with it. Todd Park talked about that earlier. With open source, there seems like some of different issues of the comparable culture, and this is about culture, so that seems appropriate to bring up. What Gunnar Hellickson described earlier, which is that government has fewer barriers to using open source But as we looked around the room, in this set, which we can assume has more open source users than perhaps the average government collection, and certainly the average collection of people coming to government, there are very few people who had actually given code back. And in terms of discussing open source in the context of government, it seems like that's a very important thing, particularly with open government, which I know each of you has been invested in on one level or another professionally now. How does that relate to the government's ability to work with developers or citizens on its own code? Can you accept contributions to it? There's a conversation going on in parallel to us right now around national security. Is that culture going to be able to change, or are we having a happy moment here, but the reality is that in agencies where serious work gets done, they'll never accept code from the citizens?
Well, I'll answer that because we are accepting code. So when we put things out under the NOSA license, the idea is that other people will participate, and in fact, they'll let us know what they're doing with it and give it back to us so that we can continue and make those changes available to everyone else and make it participatory. Because I would say the thrust of our open government is on participatory exploration. It's not just, hey, this is great, we're going to tell you what we're doing. Well, actually, we want you to participate in what we're doing too. And actually, that gives me a chance to clarify what I said earlier about the GPL. It's not that we can use software under the GPL, it's just that we can't release it back under that. That's where our own licensing issue comes up that we're still working out for the terms of service for our license.
I feel like there's a ringer in the room with NASA, though, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
I'm going to let the other folks talk then.
you all are designed to share scientific information back and forth, and that's just not true in a lot of other cases.
But I think, though, when you're looking at the mission of NASA, that's their mission. And so part of it you have to take a look at, and so when you say something like people who are doing serious government, will they be able to whatever? I mean, it's going to be dependent upon the mission and what the organization is. So when you kind of put, posit it kind of like, will it ever? Will some people never? Yeah, some people probably never will because of their mission, because what they're trying to do. They may have those limitations. And so I think part of it, again, goes back to the business case and the limits that people have. I think, though, to Emma's earlier point, though, that there are changes that are happening, and it does go with the speed of government. And we're going to be continuing to work through those. But I think that there are examples of people who are using it, and going back to Matt's opening remarks, it's just like, and the more people who use it in government, the more comfortable government gets with it, and then it becomes adopted, and so then it becomes more acceptable. I thank NASA, and I thank Emma and other agencies and Census for actually going out there and who are able to do that work and to talk about it and to share it with us.
Scott?
I'm hearing a couple of ideas that I'd be sort of interested in linking together. I think a comment that I've heard is that the interesting uses of technology don't really start until we stop talking about it, the technology being interesting. And I think to Dominic's point about change agents, part of what has happened in e-diplomacy is that it's not a singular group of like people. It's a very diverse office where diverse across a variety of types, and it brings together that, so that I think that not individually necessarily, but as a group, we bring together both the tech and the mission side of things. I think with respect to how to advance that discussion within an agency, there's certainly a lot of work ahead, but one of the things that we've found has worked, at least case by case, is abstracting the problem a little bit, being technology neutral and saying, okay, here are the business requirements and kind of what you were just saying, so that you're looking at what the mission is and what you'd like to accomplish, and then the technology is derivative or in service of that. And that's frequently not the way the process is set up now. And so it does take, kind of an intentional step to do that. But I'm interested, though, in, and I guess one more thought, and again, related to Dominic's comment before, that a lot of the needs are needs that we don't know. The case that you described is not something that we're currently dependent on. It's not a need that people appreciate because they don't have it. They've never had it. But wouldn't it be a better world if they did? And that's some of what I hear out there, and some of what was, I think, a theme in the open data discussion this morning.
I'd like to jump a little bit on that and put on my mobile hat too, because I think that one of the things that we're seeing in taking a look at, not the systems we have today, but the systems we're going to need in the future, and the way that we're going to be communicating with people in the future is really about making information available where they are and when they are. And I think that as we're moving forward, making, and looking at things as complex and simple as different apps contests. And we're looking at agencies that you wouldn't necessarily think would be very open. I mean, the Army had run apps for the Army, creating apps for soldiers to use in theater, and it was done internally among DoD, so it wasn't open to the rest of the world, but that round wasn't. But it was really looking at creating applications that people could use based upon what their needs were, in the field, and having those business cases, and then getting, in some cases, extraordinarily creative. And when we're looking at open, I want people to think about kind of the openness of the data, because those APIs that are going to be open data are going to be feeding a lot of these mobile applications. And as government may be making these applications, there's an example of the Recalls app that was created by looking at recall data from multiple agencies, and I'm not going to name them because I always forget one, but looking at information about product recalls, and that API then was published so that other people could use that API information and create their own applications as well. I think we're going to be seeing more use of data and making data available. The flip side of that, though, is that when we're looking at mobile-ready applications and information, we need to take a look at the openness of the systems that we're delivering them on, too. And so that I know a lot of people like, certain types of devices, but not everybody's using those same devices. And some of those devices are, people who are advocating open are not using the most open systems as well. And so I think that there's, we have to take a look at kind of how we're delivering information, what are the systems that we're developing right now that could create information that's going to be open for the future, so we're going to be able to deliver this information device independently and time independently and in the way that people want to receive it.
I agree with what you said about basically that a lot of times we're too uptight when it comes to this stuff. Instead of just having a problem and trying to deal with it and then letting something interesting come out of that work, we start from trying to do something interesting before the problem has before we even have the problem. And I think that raises another aspect of government culture. We need to sell things. We need to, the project has to be big and grand in order to get people time to work on it. So, yeah, it's just hard to do something tiny.
Any other questions? Comments? Going once, going twice. So thanks. I want to thank our panel. And thank all of you for on a Friday afternoon when you could be trying to skitter out of town, or for being here. And this is the stuff that oftentimes isn't talked about, and yet really can be either the grit or the grease in getting things done. And so taking time to think about it and really share experiences is thanks again for taking your time, and thanks for panelists for sharing.